Hi guys, today I have a tutorial on how to paint this river with the trees and the mountains. And just before we get into it, I just want to let you know that I just published my second Skillshare class. It's a class on how to paint flower fields, and I just share with you my basic approach to painting flower field landscapes. And I also paint 4 different flower fields so you can see how I put it all into practice. So I'll have a link down below for a free trial to try out the class and to try out Skillshare. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check out that link below. Also, the full-length version of today's tutorial is available over on my Patreon, where I take you through all the stages of the painting from the initial sketch to the very last brushstroke. It's about 2 hours in length and I am narrating while I'm painting, so you get a bit more of an insight into what I'm doing. Here's a sneak peek at some of the tutorials that are coming out in March. There'll be 5 new tutorials, and as a Patreon you also get access to all of the previous month's tutorials, so I'll have a link down below where you can check out what's currently on my Patreon. All the tutorials are in real time so you can paint along with me, and I'm really grateful for those of you who are already supporting me on there. It really means so much to me, so thank you to anyone who is already supporting me or is thinking of doing so. It really makes a huge difference to me and to this channel. Back to this tutorial, so here's the sketch that you want to start with, and then I'm going to start mixing up the color of the sky. So I'm using plenty of white and just a little bit of that cool blue, and I'm just going to mix a really light blue, so hardly any blue in there, mostly just white. And I'm just going to paint a simple gradation, starting with that pale blue at the top and just transitioning it down into pretty much pure white. I'm adding in a little bit of water just to thin down the paint a little so it can spread across the paper smoothly, but I'm also keeping up the opacity of the paint by adding in more paint as I need. And you can bring it down a little bit further than where you place in the mountains if you want, since the mountain will cover it anyways. And then I'm picking up some ultramarine blue for the mountains, and I'm going to tone it down with a little bit of burnt umber. And using this paint, I'm just going to block in this mountain. There is a little bit of a gradation from light to dark in this mountain, so I just keep that in mind. Also, you just want to judge the value of this blue that you place down. It's quite pale, and the more pale it is, the more further in the distance it is. So make sure your blue is quite light, because if it's darker, then it will start to appear much closer to the viewer, and we want to create that illusion of depth in this painting. So keep it nice and light, and then using my brush, I just nudge it up and down a little bit along the top edge of the mountain, just to give it a little bit of a tree line along the top. And then I go in with a little bit of a darker blue as I want to paint in almost a second mountain that's in front of the one that's further away. So I use a bit of a darker blue to suggest that this mountain is a little bit closer to the foreground. After the mountains, I start to work on the tree line, and my approach to this is to start from the trees that are most in the background, and we can tell from one of 2 things. One is that the trees that are further away are shorter since they're further in distance, so they get smaller and smaller. And secondly, you can tell by how light or dark they are. It's the same with the mountains. The paler they are, the further away they are. So I'm going to start by mixing up quite a pale green, just using some yellow and black, and then using white to make it paler and cooler. And then I just very loosely suggest some trees in the very far distance. I also mix up a little bit of a darker green by adding in a little bit more black, and just add a little bit of shadow to those trees so they don't look too flat. Then I outline the base of where that tree line is, and I'm going to start painting on some of the trees that are taller and closer to the foreground. I start with the base color for the trees, which is just black mixed with a little bit of yellow, and I follow the same approach as how I explained in my recent video, my gouache tree studies video, where I build up a tree in around 3 to 4 layers, starting with that base layer which is really dark, as this acts as the shadows in the trees, and then I'll start to add in more yellow to the paint to make it lighter and start to highlight it. So in this first step, I'm just painting in the silhouette, and I start by placing in the tree trunks first, and then I go in and paint on all the branches. If you want some more insight into my approach to painting trees, you can check out that gouache tree studies video. I'll have a link up in the top right hand corner. I repeat the same process on the other side, and you'll notice that I don't follow the reference photo exactly. There are a few more trees in the reference photo, but I just painted in about 4. And after I've got that base layer in, I can start to highlight the trees. But before I do that, I just want to work on those distant trees again and just make them look a little bit more full and just fill up the space a little bit more so there's not as much white gaps. For the highlights on the trees, I simply just mix in a little bit more yellow into that green mixture, and I can see the light is coming from the left hand side, so I highlight towards the left of each of the trees, and I'm going to build up the highlights in around 2 to 3 layers, so each time I'll just add in a little bit more yellow and a little bit more white. Now I want to start to pick out some of the other colors in the trees. So there are some yellow trees here, and some of them are more in shadows, so they're a little bit of a darker yellow. So I pick out some yellow ochre and I mix it with a little bit of black to darken the color, and I start to just paint on a hint of some of the trees in the shadow. I try not to get too lost in the details in the reference photo. I just focus on light and shadow. So I simply just indicate there are some trees in the shadow, and then I'll go in with some brighter colors and paint on the trees that are in the light. Now I'm going to mix up a warm bright yellow, so I'm using my warm yellow with some of my cool yellow to brighten it up, and a little bit of white as well, and I'm going to paint on those bright yellow trees. These trees are what initially drew me to this reference photo. I loved how vibrant and colorful they were, so I really want to capture this in the painting. So to keep the colors nice and bright and nice and pure, I used the mixture in quite a thick consistency, so that way when I apply it on top of some of the darker trees we painted behind, it's not going to reactivate the previous layer. So hopefully that yellow can remain quite vibrant, and where some of the trees in the shadow are receiving a little bit of light, for example towards the very top of them, I also go in and just highlight a little bit towards the top to suggest that the light is coming through some of the trees and some parts are receiving a little bit of light. When it comes to painting the river, it's all about reflecting what is above, so reflecting the sky and the trees. So for the base color of the river, I'm just going to use the same color as the sky since that is what it is reflecting. So I'm just using the cool blue mixed with white and then a little bit of ultramarine blue and some burnt umber just to tone down the blue a little, and I just block in the river with that. There's a little island on the right, and I want to first block it in with a mixture of burnt umber and white. Then I'm going to paint in some of the foliage growing around it, and I like to start with the darks first. So I mix up a dark green that's a little bit dull, so I'm using burnt umber and yellow and some of the existing green mixture on my palette, and I just very loosely just paint on and indicate some of the foliage growing around it. And as I start to highlight it, I'm just going to add in more yellow to make the paint lighter and just highlight towards the top. For the warmer parts, I use a similar mixture to the warm yellow trees from above, so just using the warm yellow mixed with a little bit of the cool yellow. Now I want to go back and paint on that yellow tree on the far right hand side. So I'm going to start with the shadows first. So mixing up more of a dull yellow, and I'm just going to paint in the shadows first, and then I'll come back with that bright yellow mixture and start to highlight the tree. And when I come back to highlight the tree, I again want to make sure that the previous layer is completely dry and that the paint I'm using now is a little bit thicker, so that way I can lay it on quite opaquely and quite clean, so it's a nice vibrant yellow. I clean off my brush as I now want to paint on some of the textures and details in that little island, so it looks a little bit rocky, or looks like there's lots of little pebbles or rocks on the floor. So I'm going to mix up some burnt umber with a little bit less white this time and just loosely indicate there's some textures there. And after that, I'm just going to fix up some of the foliage and just build it out a little bit more, add in a bit more of the shadow and the darks in there, and just play around until I like how it looks. I'm going to start working on some of the reflections now. So I'm first going to reflect that bit of foliage around that island on the right that we just painted. So I'm mixing up a similar color, just using yellow ochre with some of the existing mixture. And one of the ways I like to paint reflections is to place on the paint and then go in with a clean brush and just soften out the edges, as the water is not completely still, so there are some ripples in the water. So to help us indicate that, I like to go in with a clean brush, and by softening out the edges, it looks as though things are moving a little bit in the water, so it's not completely still. So you can see when I apply the paint, it's very loose because I know I'll come back and soften out the edges anyway. I'm more just trying to get the color in there for now, and I'll work on the shape of it with a clean brush. I left a little gap between the island and the reflection, as there's still some things in between that I want to paint, but I want to come back to it after because the reflection sits underneath that layer. So I want to do the reflections first and then paint that other bit on top of it. I repeat the same process when I'm reflecting some of the darker greener trees. So the paint mixture should just be what you already have on your paint palette, as that's what you use to paint in the trees. And for the reflection, you might just want to make it a little bit lighter, although when you go to soften out the edges, it also naturally makes the paint a bit lighter. So you don't want to go too dark, but you also don't want to go too light with it. And I'm just going to repeat this process and reflect all of the trees into the water. Now I'm just mixing up a little bit of ultramarine blue and some burnt umber and just deepening the part of the river that is a little bit further away. Then I mix up some burnt umber and warm yellow, and I think there's little plants growing here, but I didn't like how I painted them, so later I just turned these little parts into rocks. So you can just paint on little small shapes using this paint, and then I go in and just fill in the area in between with some warm yellow and some yellow ochre. It's time to start working on the left side of the painting, and I want to start by blocking in some of the darker areas with a dark greenish brown mixture. So I'm just mixing in some burnt umber into the existing green mixture on my palette, and I'm adding in a little bit of yellow to make it lighter, and I'm just going to block in that left side where the darker patches of area are. And then I paint on some of the foliage using some yellow, so using the warm yellow and some cool yellow, and I'm really just picking out some of the colors that I can see in the reference photo and just brightening up that area with some bright foliage. At this point, I want to go back to working on the river, but I just noticed that my reflections were a little bit pale. So I've mixed up some more of that muted green, and I'm going to go back into the reflections and place some more paint on and just use the same techniques as before to soften out that reflection. So just using a clean brush to drag out the paint and to soften the edges, and I clean my brush off regularly because each time you go in with your brush, it's going to pick up some of the paint on the paper. So to avoid getting really messy and letting the paint go everywhere, you can just clean off your brush frequently. I'm going to use some pure white paint, and I'm going to use it quite thickly so I can apply it onto the darker colors without any muddying happening. So I'm using this white paint to paint on some of the foam from the water that's sitting on the river, and I'm also going to use it to indicate some of the ripples in the water as well. I keep the lines nice and thin, and it starts off quite horizontally, and then as it moves down, it starts to fan out a little bit and it goes more at an angle. And when I'm doing this, I also clean off my brush between every few strokes, because when I apply the white over the river, it's going to pick up a little bit of paint as I drag my brush across, and I want to keep this white as pure as possible, so I just clean off my brush regularly. For the rocks on the water, I just mix up some burnt umber and black, and I just paint on the rough shape of rocks. They really don't need much detail at all to look realistic, because then I'll mix in a little bit of white into it and I'll just highlight towards the left side of each of the rocks, and that will easily just give them shape and depth. Lastly, we just need to work on some of the foliage in the very foreground, and I'm going to approach it in the same way as I have throughout this painting. I'm going to start by placing in the darks and the shadows, so it acts as a base layer for me to start to highlight on top of. So I'm starting with quite a dark greenish yellow as the base, and then I'm going to add more yellow and more white to it and just brighten it up and start to highlight more towards the edges of it. For the other bits of foliage, I'm just going to pick out the colors I see and just loosely suggest them, and after that I'll paint on some of the very thin branches that are hanging in front of the foliage, and then I'll mix up a little bit of the warm red with some warm orange and just paint on some more foliage on top of those branches. I'm almost finished now, and at this point I just want to have a look at my painting and see if there's any areas that I want to touch up. I usually try to bring out some more of the darks or some more of the highlights just to get a bit more contrast in the painting. I also noticed that the reflection of the trees on the right side are a little bit light, so I'm going back now with some darker paint. It is a little bit risky trying to fix up this part, but as long as you're quite careful, it is possible to still fix up the reflection and then just go over some of the ripples in the water with some more fresh white paint, and then just place on some more rocks on top of that, and that should help the reflection to look a little bit more realistic, as it was a little bit too light before, mainly because in gouache dark values dry lighter, so it was a little bit hard to judge it initially. I thought it was dark enough, but after it dried and after I painted on everything else, it was a little bit too light. And the very last thing I did before removing the tape was I wanted to extend the height of the left tree, as I thought that would make it look a little bit more balanced. Thank you for watching this tutorial, and I hope you enjoyed it. And again, the full real-time version is available on my Patreon along with many other real-time tutorials, so hopefully I will see you on there as well. Otherwise, I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye!